Air Street. I want to give a hearty coalition welcome to our new returning sponsor, if you will, iServices LLC. Links to them on our Facebook and our coalitionradio.us webpage. If you're looking for the finest in IT services, consulting, networking, network gear, web support, troubleshooting, it's available for iServices LLC. Everything you need. Web presence, you want to discuss web presence, website structure, domains, off-site storage, everything is available through iServices LLC. Folks, a very special segment tonight. And of course, we're talking about the Gino Raimondo Hall of Shame, the political Hall of Shame. And I'll be blunt, after very little thought and very little consideration, it became obvious that, in fact, the Rhode Island Commerce Corporation is now amongst the inaugural and charter members of the Hall of Shame. Of course, I have to exempt one person from that. One of my favorite people in the world, of course, Captain Carl, who will always go down in history as the guy who voted against 38 Studios. So for the record, we formally exempt him. He is not allowed in the hall. All right, so why are they in the Hall of Shame? First of all, just on a side note, I spent part of my day involved in a Twitter battle, some screenshots of which we've taken and we'll put up on the Facebook page at the Coalition Radio Facebook page with a prominent member of said Rhode Island Commerce Corporation, which is always astonishing. And by the way, no, I'm not talking about Kurt Schilling. I don't think he's been incorporated into the Commerce Corporation yet, although if it comes to sweat equity, clearly he's your guy. I was interviewed by Bill Rapley earlier this evening, may or may not make the news. Bill, by the way, my hat's off to him. He's a mainstream media guy, very talented political reporter, and has always been willing to give a voice to independent media, and has always sought out and used the shoe leather to find the real story. I admire him greatly. We talked about, of course, 38 Stadium. Now, depending on the day, depending on the moment this week, 38 Stadium may or may not be alive. Depends who you talk to. It would appear that the true inaugural member of the Hall of Shame, and actually someone we like as well, but we had to single out because of his support of the stadium. Of course, we're talking about Pawtucket Mayor Don Grebian. It would appear went into this week thinking that he actually had the support of the Commerce Corporation and Governor Gino Raimondo. Now, I guess it's the sports equivalent of a football team owner getting up and saying we're 100% behind, 110% behind in our support of our coach. Anyone who's more than a casual football fan will know, in fact, that means the clock is ticking. You know, the next website you should go to after you clear your browser at work, all right, always the first thing, clear that browser at work. All right, the second website you should be going to is jobs.com, monster.com, or whatever. Now, in this case, this little bit of political intrigue, or as we would like to say, étude, Mayor Don Grebian, came from Governor Raimondo and her Commerce Corporation, who, by all public accounts and some personal recognition, had spent months, I'd say months, working out a solution, if you will, to find a way to use your tax dollars to subsidize what we refer to here as the Fenway wet dream of a few selected billionaires. Now, to this Twitter battle, the constant refrain, of course, is ancillary development and that it's going to pay for itself. To which, of course, we utter the traditional Coalition Radio response, this being, of course, on a family station, balderdash. There's all talk about tax receipts and generating initial income, the multiplier effect. And yet, when presented with the facts in the midst of this Twitter back and forth, ultimately, said Commerce Corporation official reverted to the insult that every activist in Rhode Island has felt. That people like me are bitter, negative, and cynical. Tony, am I bitter, negative, or cynical?
All of the above.
All of the above, absolutely. Bingo, guilty. Absolutely guilty as charged. But why am I bitter, cynical, and negative? Or as our former governor, Lincoln Chafee, accused me once of being a nattering nabob of a negativity. Hell, I've had a lot more people, more famous than that guy, call me negative and cynical. Joe Trillo, because of my opposition to casino gambling and his desire to build a casino in East Greenwich, called me a negative and cynical. A former Senate Majority Leader, back in the day known as a Little General, he called me a negative, cynical, bitter individual. He ended up, by the way, up in charges. 2 former speakers have called me that. Half of the Rhode Island Economic Development Corporation, under the then governor, most famous for bringing us 38 studios, that would be, of course, Governor Carcieri, called me bitter and cynical. So let's explain my bitterness and cynicism. And truly, just joining me in the studio was a fellow warrior on that trail. Let's talk about 38 studios. We're being told right now by the doyens, the denizens, if you will, of the Commerce Corporation, that this has nothing to do with 38 studios. And that's silly. Actually, this guy went so far as to call me stupid and call my arguments stupid. That is silly to compare them. One is a private-public partnership. As one prominent talk show host pointed out this week, that my activities as a libertarian would never garner any level of traction, if you will, with the community because I didn't understand. I didn't understand, if you will, the nature of the private-public partnership and how fundamental it was to American life. So let's put it in really blunt human terms, okay? We have a call coming in. But let's put it in really blunt human terms. The notion that we're bitter and cynical is based purely on experience. How many millions were wasted in 38 studios? How many loans were defaulted in a constant state of default by the Commerce Corporation? Now, I'd like to point out in the past incarnations of the Commerce Corporation's website, when the Economic Development Corporation and various websites of the state of Rhode Island used to actually put out, for full disclosure, the loan status of a number of the companies that had some type of, and we'll use the Coalition Radio air quotes, investments. When most of those investments went into default, a steel company in Cumberland, a company that did solar panels for roofs, didn't actually build them, but did research into them, a company that did game show, all of that. All of a sudden, that became, as we like to say, a vapor story. All of a sudden, that didn't matter. So while an entire generation here in Rhode Island has been lost to the failure of the public school system, while an entire generation has been traded to the decay of the public infrastructure of this state, while at the same time, failed investments in crony corporatism have cost this state dearly because of the sheer incompetence of the individuals charged to do the assessment of said investments, and who have a uniquely uninterrupted, as I call it, trail of tears, of unadulterated failure, while at the same time engage in a pattern of redistribution of assets to which they should have no legal claim. And that would, I would, of course, would say, the tax dollars of you or I or any one of the hundreds of thousands of Rhode Islanders who are hardworking, have families, as they have frittered them away, and time after time failed on a level so epic as to be barely definable. If anything, their record is so epically consistent in failure, in providing any level of real economic activity, as to be astonishing in its own right. So now what is the current governor and what is the current Commerce Corporation doing on your behalf? They're providing millions of dollars of seed capital to out-of-state corporations who would come into the state and compete directly with the businesses and the efforts of native Rhode Islanders. What's wrong with that? Literally, they are asking Rhode Islanders to take money out of their pocket and subsidize businesses, for example, like Vistaprint, that would put them out of business. As I mentioned to Mr. Rapley earlier today, how would you feel if you owned a business that you had spent years, perhaps multiple generations in building, to have to pay to help put yourself out of business? If that's not appalling enough, look at the investments going into all these innovation districts. By the way, didn't we have an innovation officer? We've conveniently forgotten about that, haven't we? On the 195 corridor, with which the government was tasked, inappropriate I might add, but the task was to bring in new, fresh economic blood, to engage in a pattern of behavior which would create a level playing field to make it attractive for new, fresh economic blood. We are actually subsidizing a tax-exempt Brown University in the form of a third-party business incubator. Now think about that for a moment. If the state of Rhode Island has, in its own way, has proven grotesquely incapable of creating an environment with which any business incubation can occur, we're then going to pay someone else to create it? And then part of those monies are going to be brought in, used to enlarge the footprint of an organization that's already tax exempt. Now, I support Brown University, the Rhode Island School of Design, Providence College, the University of Rhode Island, both in its South County and downtown incarnations, JWU, RIC, CCRI. In fact, I would go so far as to argue if it wasn't for that unique mix of colleges, universities, that Rhode Island would be a far poorer place. And I don't mean just financially, but I mean culturally. This is a wonderful city because of those universities, but at the same time, there is absolutely no justification to provide seed capital or to pay people to continue to subsidize that investment. I'm not arguing for changes in the pilot program, the payment in lieu of taxes program at any of those universities at all. But we're going to continue to double down on tax-exempt organizations because of a failure in leadership and getting outside businesses here, because we're unable to see the forest for the trees and we're unable to understand that it's not short-term gains that attract businesses that will act at some level of perpetuity here in Rhode Island. No, that it is in fact the combination of lifestyle, a healthy mix of universities, an educated workforce that stems not from arbitrary and fake programs that temporarily create the illusion that people are being educated, but come from a strong primary and secondary school system that can work in conjunction with some of the finest universities in the world that happen to be here already. There's no easy fix. It took generations to take Rhode Island from literally one of the leadership positions in the industrial world to a point where we are essentially a bankrupt welfare state. But as poor as challenged as we may be, we have finally reached a point in this state where we understand the difference between organic economic growth that occurs because of the risk capital and the sweat equity and the hard work and innovation of the individual, and this notion that the wealthy and selected among us can somehow justify the use of the taxpayer dollars of the great unwashed, if you will, people like me and you, that somehow there's a level of entitlement to that because we are to repeatedly believe the flawed statistics and the deeply flawed analysis of the Commerce Corporation. And we're supposed to somehow trust them. but their numbers have never worked. We hemorrhage cash on a monthly basis because of convention centers, Ryan centers, and the Dunk, and yes, the mall. As the mall begins to recede into the background, was that ever more than just a shell game that brought into town national corporations who will just as quickly leave when the pickings are slim? With all these grants we're giving out, who decided that it was the role of government, as so often said, almost cliche, to pick winners and losers? Who decided that it was their money that they so could, on such a cavalier basis, engage in income distribution to the select few? Who decided that? The answer has been so glaringly obvious for a generation now. It's quite simple. A tax structure that rewards innovation by the individual without financial commitment by a broken taxpayer. Looking at the educational system is not just a set of cliches and buzzwords, but actually creating a system that it incentivizes success at the primary level so that we don't lose another generation. Has nothing to do with the corporatization of higher education. Nothing to do with out-of-state multinationals coming in to give what Gina and the Economic Development Corporation / the Commerce Corporation would have you believe is the buzzword of the future. All you hear from them is, we need more people to code. No, we don't. We need people to innovate. And innovation requires critical thinking skills that, quite frankly, our school system is not prepared to help develop in this state, both on the primary and secondary level. We have a governor who's so desperate to maintain her voter base that she's willing to give the same level of promises to a free university education that she afforded Mayor Don Grebian and her support, if you will. Her support of the now dead stadium proposal. Yet make no mistake, Stephen Pryor and his organization, if they are able to pull the rabbit out of the hat, whether it be now in the waning days of this legislative session, or in the months to come through some sort of legislative session, if there's a way for them to finance this investment without taxpayer approval and without risk, as they feel, in their own political calculus to their careers and their six-figure jobs, they will absolutely do it. How is it that the Commerce Corporation was able to engage in the development, discussion, and potential legislation for a sophisticated set of bond issues issued by an agency of which there is no history, in a city which has no money and little future at this point? And I'll define future as defined by the efforts of this group, the Commerce Corporation. Because if it has a future, it's out of, once again, the organic innovation of dozens of individuals who are choosing to work hard with their own risk capital, their own sweat equity, in creating an entertainment district and a beverage production business and artisan food production in the city of Pawtucket. If there's any future in the city, it's despite the best efforts of the Commerce Corporation, because the Commerce Corporation was willing to saddle the city of Pawtucket with $15 million of bond indebtedness. The schools, as it's been defined by me, I would say by phone calls made to me, are in shambles on a structural basis. Yet somehow they can find $15 million in bonded indebtedness to support an entertainment investment that is privately owned, and whose repayment is contingent effectively on the success of a baseball team, whose numbers they are willing to at least philosophically guarantee, but without any sort of personal guarantees or any real accountability, ultimately would fall, given their almost predetermined failure, on the taxpayers of this state. That's your Commerce Corporation. And when confronted with all of this, they go back to the original Rhode Island cliche. You should be happy to live here. I'm expecting when I get home and I read those tweets that it'll tell me, you should be down in South County with your toes in the sand after enjoying a meal on Federal Hill. Why are you so negative? I'm negative because it's born of experience and pain. Your school systems were incapable of educating my children. I had to take them elsewhere. As Mr. Cody did, as so many people who somehow managed to scrape together the means to do so. You pay confiscatory taxes despite, on a personal level, having to replicate almost each and every one of those services. And that's justice. That's good government. That's transparent. Sorry, folks. Not buying it. And that is why your Rhode Island Commerce Corporation is a charter member in the Gina Raimondo Political Hall O